Good morning and welcome to this Master Your Dragon series on advanced skills and emotional competence. And today we're going to be specifically looking at what we're calling the dragon or the survival brain and two specific drives. Its drive to form a tribe and its drive to gain power. And just to remind us what we've done, so in Module 1, we particularly started looking at this dynamic between our conscious rational self, very much led by our prefrontal cortex, and this subconscious irrational part we have of ourselves that is very much situated within our survival brain and what's typically called the reptilian and the mammalian brains. And within this dynamic, we need to be able to start understanding what drives our subconscious irrational part of ourselves. And today we're just going to focus on two specific drives, which is the drive for power, tribe and the drive for power. So if we start off with the drive to belong to a tribe, as human beings, we all have an unconscious need to be part of a tribe. And with a tribe, I mean by who you define as your people. So quite often that will be your family, it might be your church, it might be a specific friendship group that you belong to. Sometimes you might consider your nation a tribe or your political party a tribe, but pretty much that will be, these are my people. And the reason why we have this drive is because sort of evolutionary wise, there's a tendency to think, well, you see different groups, and underlying it is this irrational belief that you're safer with people who are like you. So if I just hang out with people who are similar to me, I'm less likely to come to some sort of a harm. And sort of an automatic behavior that we also see in animals, and they tend to stay with their own kind, so to speak. But this does drive very particular behaviors in terms of human society. And I'll give a few little examples. So for example, if you go into a new scenario or an unfamiliar scenario, like say a new school or a university or a conference, you might seek out a group where people are more similar to you in terms of how they look perhaps, or how they behave. And teenagers, classically, that teenage time when there's a desperate need to belong to a group, to find your friendship group, and that whole aspect of peer pressure belongs very much to this drive. So there's a need to be able to be included, and there's a huge fear of being excluded from that tribe. We also have things, therefore, that we find this tribe quite often we will look to our social group to decide how we are going to behave. So we find, for example, people behave differently if they're on their own. So they come across somebody that's injured, they will definitely help. If somebody's injured in the street, there's lots of people around, people are actually less likely to help because there's a little bit of a looking at, well, what's somebody else doing? It's sort of an unconscious way of trying to figure out what the right behavior is in a scenario. And marketing agencies know this. We're also more likely to listen to or believe people who either look like us or behave like us or have a similar interests or history to us. This in itself is not a problem unless it's unchecked and we're not aware of this. And the issue that I want to specifically look like today is how this drives prejudice. So our survival brain, our dragon, does not like diversity. Only looks for people who are like us. And so it's very natural whenever you meet somebody who's very different from yourself, might have very different ideas, beliefs, might look very different, there's a natural instinct of a little bit of that arises. And it's the inbuilt natural reaction. And the idea is that underlyingly there's a feeling, well, can I trust this person? Can I not trust this person? And the more different the person is from you, the less likely you are to trust them. And again, this is based on this irrational belief that just because somebody is different might potentially be dangerous. Most of us are quite good at keeping this in check. You have this initial, oh, I'm not so sure. But you know that if you spend a bit of time, get to know somebody, you'll actually find out that they're probably not different from yourself as you think. But of course, if you don't keep these prejudice feelings in check, then a tribe can start using it as a need to separate from somebody, to exclude somebody, or even to purge whole groups from their communities. So I want to look a little bit at the difference between what I'm calling this drive, which is purely based on the rules of the survival part of ourselves, and the more inclusive communities that as humanity we are trying to build. So the typical tribe will be very much a group that's built around these either similar genetic or certain circumstantial qualities. So for example, we group together with people who are a similar race or a similar ability level, similar sexual orientation or a similar gender identity or a similar socioeconomic status. And one of the ways to understand whether this is a tribe or a community is whether there are rules about who's allowed to belong to that tribe. So usually dragon tribes are exclusive, and they will have either very explicit rules or policies or even just cultural taboos that determines who belong to us and who does not belong to us. This is what builds nationalities, it's what builds brands, it's what builds groups of ideologies, for example. And the way you can tell whether this is more of a tribe rather than a community is that those who are in power is going to decide who can be part of this tribe. An inclusive community is something very different. Now you actually go towards a group because you've got common vision, common ideas, common beliefs. If you are in a workplace where you're doing something that you really love and that's really important to you, you might be building a community of people who all have the same vision or ideas in place. This kind of vision is usually very inclusive. So it doesn't matter what you look like or where you come from or who you are. It's a whole heterogeneous group of lots of different people, but we all share the same higher ideas. And it sort of very much belong to this higher part of ourselves. And so generally these groups are open and accepting and quite flexible. And very important is that you as an individual decide, I want to join this community because I sign up to this vision or idea or beliefs. There's nobody in the community that decides who belongs or doesn't. There's, of course, lots of groups that has a bit of both. So, for example, churches might have quite a strong tribe feeling, especially if they're quite clear about who is allowed to be part of that church and who isn't. And then you get churches that are very inclusive and very much built around particular visions, ideas, and sometimes there's a little bit of overlap at all. What's very true for both of these, and that lies within this inner drive of us, is that there's a huge cost when you feel you're not part of a tribe or a community. So if in some way one feels excluded or are actively pushed out and excluded out of a community, one has these intense feelings of shame or loneliness or isolation, and there is therefore quite a hard, solid drive in human beings to try and find themselves part of these communities. So let's move on to the drive of power, to gain power, because the two are actually quite strongly related. Because if you are in a tribe, especially those dragon tribes, the more power you have within that tribe, the more safe you are and the more resources you have access to. And remember, I said it's the people in power who decides who's in and out of the group. So the more power you have in the group, the more likely it is that you can determine that you're not going to get excluded out of that group, and you end up being the one to decide who is in and who is out. So there's different kinds of power. Political power, the classic one, and the higher you are up in terms of your government. Financial power in our current world. Economic power gets you huge power in the world of today. The richer you are, the more you get to say. Expertise power, so that's in the world of academics, but in the world of any science where there's expertise needed, the more you know and the more access you have, the more you've published, and the more power you will have in that community. And then, of course, with social media, we have a whole new range of power that is around social clout, your influencers, your celebrities, and your ability to influence things society because of the amount of followers that you have on your social media page. What's interesting with power is that it has a biological imprint. So this need for power, the more power we have, it actually slightly boosts our testosterone. So if you're watching a sports game and your team wins, you'll actually have literally an increase of testosterone in your body, and it gives you a feeling of power. So one of the key irrational beliefs that lies in this drive, and that we all have a little bit, is this feeling that, well, I am actually slightly more valid than you. So this idea that it's an irrational belief that I've got more right to have an opinion, I have more right to the resources, I have more right to help make a decision in this scenario, I have more say in what's going to happen. And we all have that a little bit, especially when we meet people very different from ourselves. But of course, the more privilege you have, the more sure you are that you are a little bit more valid, a little bit more right than somebody else. So, of course, this drive for power, which all human beings have and is very strong within tribal societies, that's at the core of what drove colonialism. It's what made white people or various travelers all over the world go to areas and simply consider themselves more powerful, more important, more valid than the people they found in those countries, and literally used violence to take over the resources of those people. All of the manifestations of war, in terms of what we're seeing in the Ukraine at the moment and what's happening in Israel, those are all both tribe and power politics coming into play. Persecution of marginalized communities, and I'm going to talk quite a little bit about that. And then gender-based violence is also specifically linked not to a drive for sex, but specifically around a drive for power. And we have shown that people who have feelings of being powerless, so in themselves, feeling they have no power, are more likely to either bully somebody else or engage in gender-based violence against somebody else because it gives them this temporary experience of power. And again, a very unconscious drive that we need to be aware of. I want to talk a little bit about oppression and marginalization because it's quite important in the world that we live in today, and this understanding of opinion. So opinion of those in power build the world the powerless live in. And let's just look at what that means. And I want to draw here on the what's called the Wheel of Power. I'm drawn Sylvia Duckworth. This is particularly from the world of refugees and anti-racism. And there's become an understanding of, as human beings, we are all born either with very specific unearned advantages. These are things you just happen to have, or certain unearned disadvantages. And depending on what these advantages or disadvantages are, will give you either more power in a community or less power. And with power, I mean the ability to actually influence the world that you live in. So for example, if you are white and you have a post-secondary qualification, you're able-bodied, you're heterosexual, you're neurotypical, you've got a robust mental health and you're quite slim in body size, if you own property and you are rich, if you're English speaking and you're a cisgendered man, if you've got citizenship, all of those components gives you more power within a society, especially a tribal society, to be able to influence what happens in that society and what happens in your own life. The more you are on the periphery, and the further you are away of being able to actually influence what happens in society. So all of our systems of classification, marginalization, discrimination, and oppression is based on this power dynamic and people in power deciding who gets included and who does not get included within the tribe. So opinion equity speaks about the fact that we quite often have debates around freedom of expression, and that's going on a lot at the moment as we're talking about the hate speech bill, for example. And there's always this terrified fear, don't you dare influence our freedom of expression. But it's important to realize that freedom of expression is not an equal playing field. So if you've got an opinion and you are the one in power and making all the decisions, your opinion is going to carry much more weight than somebody who is marginalized and does not have much power within that community. And especially if you have opinions on what you think should be happening to those marginalized people. And so there's more and more of an understanding that it's not just talking about freedom of speech, but what is actually the freedom of reach of somebody who has decided to express an opinion about somebody else who does not have much power. So as a society, we are hopefully evolving and trying to move away from these tribes that are based mostly on power and trying to base work of communities based on inclusion. And to be able to do that, we have to start becoming aware of these different levels of opinion. And we can look a little bit in history to show us how that's developed. So for example, as little as just over 100 years ago, men still carried the predominant power within the world, and women had very little power in terms of making decisions either politically or financially. And it was men, therefore, that decided that women should not have the vote, that women could not go to universities, that women's place was in the home. And all of the decisions that was made around women had no women making part of that decision making. So the opinions of women had no play in terms of what was happening. And for example, votes for women only came through women actually fighting and literally having to take to the streets to try and gain some power to be able to get the vote. And there were men very actively opposing that. Even the decision to give women the vote was made by a bunch of men sitting in a parliament. More closer in history, in the last 100 years, we've seen very much what happens when one race has a lot more power, particularly in terms of gunpowder power, and white people therefore having made decisions around the lives of people of color. And right from apartheid days, the civil rights movement in America, and more recently, Black Lives Matter, those are all scenarios where predominantly, again, it is white people who would sit and make decisions about what was going to happen in the lives of people of color. And again, within those people who make decisions, there was no people of color involved in making decisions about their political futures, about their rights within those countries. And in South Africa, we had to have actual a revolution or people actually fighting to actually get those rights in a country where they are awarded no power. And people who had opinion, for example, Steve Biko, having strong opinions about, for example, Black consciousness that was simply used through the use of power, such as violence to suppress the opinions of those not in power. But this, as a society, we are progressing and we are now meeting a new threshold. So from 1969, there's been particularly much more consciousness, again, around the rise of queer people and their power and their pride. And again, the same scenario. So we've had straight people who are the majority of people within a community. And those people, again, because of numbers, they have more power to decide who is included and who's not included. They would have their own opinions on what they think queer people should or should not be doing. And so your LGBTQIA plus society has been actively excluded in very many realms of society and political power, again, by straight people making those decisions. And we are still frighteningly seeing many countries in Africa still using this people in power, making the decision who gets included and who doesn't. I want to specifically speak around trans people. We've seen in the last 5 years, more trans people becoming more and more open and out in terms of wanting to live their own authentic lives. And again, there are a range of people who are cisgendered, who are not transgender, who is denying, simply deciding that their opinion, that cisgender, there's only two sexes, is more right than those people who have a different experience within their own lives. And again, they are using their opinions and their power and their privilege to actively try and block trans people from being able to access services or be able to have their own rights for self-determination or legal rights. And in these battles that we are fighting, we are slowly trying as a society to move away from these extraordinary tribal politics and the persecution, oppression, and marginalization that it creates. So I want to close off with a little exercise, and in the there's going to be like a download of different reflection tools that one can use throughout this course, and there's one specifically on a power privilege reflection. So I want you to look at the green here at the top, which is all unearned privileges, and see which ones of these boxes you can tick for yourself. So what might you have been born with? And then, and again, to then also just become aware of what unearned disadvantages you might have simply because of who you are or in what family you were born into. What's interesting as a reflection exercise is to notice how you relate to the polar opposite, whether you are in the green or on the red. Specifically looking at, well, if you are somebody, for example, who are heterosexual, how do you view people who are lesbian, bisexual, or asexual? If you are somebody who owns property, how do you feel about the homeless person standing on the street corner? And interestingly enough, there's a whole range of different ways in how we respond. So the dragon will tend to be more prejudicial and tend to have more antipathy to those particular groups and will definitely feel itself a little bit more important than the polar opposite. But similarly, we have this higher part of ourselves, and quite often we can, through reflection, really understand this fact that, well, we're no different than this other person, and actually have a need to use our privilege and to use our own positions to actually help and assist and support and be allies for those people that might be very different from ourselves. This, for me, is an important module when we start looking at something as the dream of everyone, isn't it? World peace. And if we're talking about world peace, and if we're talking about building societies that are not ravaged with war, persecution, and oppression, we need to start understanding our drive for tribe and our drive for power.